I rise today to introduce the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act amendments of 2010. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, known as RECA, was first introduced in this body 21 years ago today. Proposed by the senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch, this original legislation was a monumental step in recognizing some of the unheralded victims of the Cold War era. As the United States government built up its Cold War nuclear arsenal during the mid-20th century, many Americans paid the price with their health. Some were sickened through exposure to above-ground atomic weapons tests. Others were exposed to heavy doses of radiation from working in the uranium mining industry. All the while, the government was slow to implement federal protections. As a result, a generation of Americans who worked in the mines or lived near testing sites became sick with serious diseases like lung cancer and kidney disease and many others. Much of the United States uranium development occurred on the Navajo Nation. That's where jobs in the mines and mills drew workers from the surrounding rural areas. These workers and much of the country were unaware of the dangers of radiation exposure. And this was despite reports from the European mining industry indicating that uranium mining led to high rates of lung cancer. There should have been a warning call. There should have been a wake-up call, but there wasn't. In the ensuing years, rates of lung cancer among Navajo Indians went from disproportionately low to disproportionately high compared with the rest of the U.S. population. This was clearly a result of uranium development and the related radiation exposure. In addition to lung cancer, numerous other illnesses began to emerge in the men and women who worked in the uranium mining industry. These individuals were not limited to the Navajo Nation. In my home state of New Mexico, the Pueblo of Laguna was home to the nation's largest open-pit uranium mine. Workers from across the state came to the mines, especially from the economically struggling communities of rural New Mexico. In the late 1970s, my father, Stuart Udall, took up the fight for these workers. In 1979, my father filed 32 claims against the Department of Energy on behalf of widows of deceased Navajo uranium miners. In many ways, this marked the beginning of the fight for compensation for all uranium workers. I remember working those years with my whole family to collect information and push for recognition. It was a family effort to fight for justice, and for me, it continues to be a family priority. 10 years later, the original RECA legislation was introduced in the United States Senate. It passed in 1990, giving a level of restitution to sick miners and millers, as well as individuals living downwind of nuclear tests. Amendments to RECA have occurred over the ensuing decades, most significantly in 2000. That's when the act was expanded to include mill workers and ore transporters and expand downwind counties, among other things. Today, with Senators Jeff Bingaman, Mike Crapo, Mark Udall, Michael Bennett, and James Risch, I introduce a piece of legislation that takes the next step in addressing the remaining shortfalls of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. I would like to highlight some of the provisions of our bill. First, the inclusion of post-1971 uranium miners and workers as qualified claimants. While the federal government ceased purchase of domestic uranium in 1971, implementation of federal work safety standards was slow and regulation of mines was poor. As a result, thousands of miners and millers were never made aware of the dangers of the yellow cake they handled on a regular basis. In recent surveys, the majority of uranium workers from this period report that they did not have showers or wash basins in the mines where they worked. They often took contaminated clothing home for laundering, unaware of the hazards and with no other option for cleaning. Many also report that ventilation to prevent unnecessary exposure was not provided in their work areas. Today, these workers continue to suffer and die from illnesses related to radiation exposure. But because their employment dates began after 1971, they have no opportunity for compensation. Our bill changes that. If the measure passes, individuals working from 1971 until 1990 will qualify to claim compensation for exposure-related diseases. The bill we're introducing today would also expand the geographic areas that qualify for downwind compensation to include New Mexico, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Guam. And for the first time, the bill recognizes downwind exposure from the original atomic weapons test site, the Trinity site in New Mexico. This legislation would raise compensation levels for those exposed as a result of above-ground weapons tests. This would make their compensation consistent with their counterparts who worked in the mines and mills. The bill would also facilitate epidemiological research on the impacts of uranium development on communities and families of uranium workers. It authorizes funding for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences to award grants to universities and nonprofits to carry out such research. We are seeking to broaden the use of affidavits to substantiate employment history and residence in an affected downwind area. Many who have suffered as a result of Cold War uranium and weapons development do not have the documentation to prove their exposure. Often mines and mills did not keep proper documentation of their workers, and many communities impacted did not have a tradition of keeping birth and marriage certification. The bill would allow individuals to combine their time worked in multiple positions to meet the work time requirements for compensation in the original RECA legislation. Finally, this legislation would allow miners to be compensated for kidney disease, and it would allow core drillers to join miners, millers, and ore transporters on the current list of uranium workers who qualify for compensation under the Act. Uranium and weapons development of the Cold War era left a gruesome legacy in communities of mine workers and downwinders. For more than 2 decades now, the United States has tried to compensate in some way for the sickness and loss of life. Today, we are taking the next step to close this sad chapter in history and to improve the reach of compassionate compensation to those Americans who have suffered but have not qualified under RECA in its current form. In introducing this legislation, I'd like to honor all those who continue to suffer from deadly illnesses as a result of radiation exposure but do not qualify for compensation, especially those uranium workers who began employment after 1971 and thus did not qualify for RECA. I look forward to working with my colleagues to recognize these individuals and expand RECA to include all who are justified in receiving radiation exposure compensation.